Hello, my name is Lisa Rowbottom. I'm a psychologist here at Sojourn Psychology, and I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about anxiety. As those of you who follow our vlogs might have noticed, I've started a series on different mental health diagnoses that I commonly see in my office, and the hope of these videos is to provide you with a tool to understand your own mental health diagnoses, or to be able to use this tool to help others understand what's going on with you and with the mental health challenges you're facing. So today we're going to start working on anxiety. Now, anxiety is one of those difficult diagnoses to explain because the experience of the emotion or the feeling of anxiety is universal. And so most of us at one time or another have felt anxious about, an upcoming test or maybe getting up to speak in front of people. The difference between someone with an anxiety disorder and someone who's simply experiencing a feeling of anxiety is that often the person experiencing the feeling is able to overcome that anxiety by setting the emotion aside and moving forward, or recognizing that the thoughts are illogical and making a decision to change their thought processes, or even to distract themselves with something else going on in their day. The difference with an anxiety disorder, however, is that often the brain will get stuck in that experience of anxiety. And the longer the brain ruminates on whatever is making an individual anxious, the more the body reacts, which then causes a cycle of interaction between the brain and body that maintains a very high level of anxiety. And a lot of times an individual with an anxiety disorder is unable to, without special techniques, simply take a step back from the anxiety or to just stop thinking about something. And you can see this in the definition of an anxiety disorder, which is the presence of excessive anxiety. So it's not just worry about the average day-to-day stuff we run into, but it expands itself from the day-to-day to the hypothetical, to the past, to what other people are thinking. It can touch a lot of different places in a person's life. And then we have behaviors that start happening due to the occurrence of that anxiety, which include avoidance, isolation, self-criticism, even trying to cope with bad habits like overeating, any way to help bring that anxiety down to what feels like a more manageable level. One of the ways to look at anxiety is to imagine it kind of like the smoke alarm in your kitchen. So we all usually have a smoke detector somewhere in our house. And that smoke alarm, that smoke detector is there for a very good reason. We need it in case there's a fire. We need to know so we can do what we have to do to keep ourselves safe. Our anxiety system is exactly the same. It kicks in automatically, just like our smoke detector. And it's there so that we're able to take the actions we need to take in order to keep ourselves safe. And so what happens when our anxiety system kicks in is that there's a shift in the blood flow in the brain. So it moves more to the survival part of the brain, away from the thinking part of our brain, so that we're able to make instinctive decisions as opposed to having to reason them through. Our body systems shift so that we start to have an increase in heart rate. There's an increase in blood flow to the muscles because we're getting prepared to run away. Often there can be shaking. Sometimes people get muscle cramps, muscle spasms, just because of the tightness in their muscles. A person's body will also try and lighten itself. So there might be sweating, they might feel really nauseous, might end up running to the bathroom a lot, because our system automatically preps itself to enable us to run away. Now, just like A smoke alarm in our kitchen, though, it can't decide on its own when it's needed and when it's not. And so sometimes smoke alarms go off because we need them to, but sometimes they go off because we burnt the toast or we overcooked the turkey or these things that we actually don't need it for, but it's going off anyway just because of its sensitivity to certain things. And then, we have to go over there and do some intentional action to shut it down. Now, a person with an anxiety disorder has a very sensitive smoke alarm, so to speak. So the things that would happen that would set off the alarm of somebody without the disorder are at a certain degree of seriousness, but a person with the disorder needs much less intensity for the full force of their anxiety disorder to kick in. Now, one of the challenges of anxiety disorder is because of the shifts in the brain chemistry, it can be difficult to reason through or to learn new techniques when one is in a state of high anxiety. When a person has perhaps mild to moderate, it's very possible to come into a psychologist's office. We can teach you additional techniques. We can teach you ways to work your way through the thought processes, to step back from the rumination, and to calm the body. And most of the time, people are able to pick up on those and are able to implement them. When you're faced with moderate to severe anxiety, there are people who are still able to learn new techniques and implement them. So it's definitely possible. But a lot of people really struggle because we're introducing a new way of thinking to a person who is already having challenges learning new things and thinking due to the shift in brain chemistry. And so sometimes at that point, a person may consider some medication. For some people, it's simply to lower the anxiety levels enough to allow them to learn techniques to use with their anxiety. And then at that point, perhaps they'll have a discussion with their doctor about lowering their anxiety medication so that they can implement their strategies so that eventually they can come off the medication. For some people, if there is a purely biological cause to the anxiety, then they may choose a low dose for the rest of their lives. There are options out there. And obviously, with myself not being a medical doctor, none of this is medical advice. However, people tend to look at two kinds of medication. There can be the benzodiazepine class, which is what we typically think of as Ativan, those type of medications. And the purpose behind those medications is to immediately calm the body, calm the system, reduce the anxiety levels. So when you take one of those, everything seems to come down really fast. So in a period of half an hour, somewhere along there, depending on the person, you're going to notice a difference. And you're going to stay settled until the medication works its way through your system, which, could be a day or so. Now, those type of medications need to be used under medical supervision because there is the potential of abuse for them. As long as your doctor is monitoring, you will be fine. And as long as you're not changing your dosages without your doctor's orders, then you will avoid major addiction. Oftentimes, as with most medications, when you decide to come off of it, it's good to do it gradually just to give your system time to adjust and to make sure your doctor is supervising you. But it's not like you're going to become an addict simply by occasionally using a benzodiazepine to control intense anxiety reactions. The other option that's out there is part of the antidepressant class of medication. And so they're a slower acting medication where there's a gradual increase in dosage. And as the dosage goes up, then the level of anxiety gradually decreases. These are a longer lasting medication and they will generally have less addictive qualities to them. Again, coming off of any medication, your system needs time to adjust to something changing chemically in your body. But beyond that, there's not a chance of an increasing addiction to it. And so perhaps considering a medication to help yourself come down to a level where you can use new strategies may be worth a discussion with your doctor. The next thing I want to talk about just briefly is anxiety in the brain, because I'm a person who learns best from visual examples. So I just wanted to let you see some of the brain differences that occur in a person with an anxiety disorder. And I find these are pretty clear in showing there is actually something different happening. So it's just not a matter of just, you're obviously not good enough at managing your emotions that you can't bring this under control. So here we have a scan of a normal brain and a scan of a brain with an anxiety disorder. And you can see the differences in activation levels throughout the brain. The person's brain with the anxiety disorder is much more active, and it has spots where it's highly active, but very few of the dark blue to black where the brain activity is actually settled. And so when you see this kind of a difference, a lot of times what's happening is with a person with anxiety disorders, they get stuck in this rumination cycle, thinking about everything that could potentially go wrong and looking for things that could go wrong and looking for disasters. And it's because of the activity level in the brain. This next one is an image of a brain from a study that looked at trait anxiety and state anxiety. So in this study, when they were talking about trait anxiety, they're talking about a personality trait that makes a person vulnerable to being more anxious about more things. So if a person has an anxiety disorder, we would classify that as a trait anxiety. State anxiety is generally the anxiety that most of us experience. So we enter into a short-lasting state of anxiety over something specific, and then we work our way out of it. And as you can see, the activity in the brain changes depending on whether you have trait or state anxiety. And so the experience of state anxiety is different than trait anxiety, and it has different characteristics because we're looking at different parts of the brain which do different things. Now, this last one is a scan of the activity in a normal brain versus the activity in the brain of somebody with anxiety or with an anxiety disorder. And again, you can see here that the brain is highly, highly activated in the anxiety state, the excessive electrical brain activity happening here. Whereas in the normal brain, it's much less active. And the important thing to note here is that this scan is taken when somebody is in a resting state. So it's not that the person with excessive electrical brain activity has worked themselves up into an anxious state and then they've compared the two. It's when a person is attempting to rest and simply be, the brain of the anxious person is much more active than the brain of somebody who, is pretty much in a normal space and experiences periods of anxiety. And so I hope that this gives you the opportunity to understand a little bit more about what's happening with anxiety, and maybe to recognize that it's more than just an inability to think clearly like other people can. It's not a moral failing. It's not something wrong with your personality. It's actually a difference in the brain, and it's a difference in the sensitivity of the autonomic or the emergency nervous system that activates without our knowledge. And a lot of people with anxiety disorders, they're doing the best they can to cope. And they're actually working against certain characteristics in their body that make it more difficult for them than the average person to manage that anxiety. So hopefully this was helpful, and stay tuned for our next one. I'm going to talk a little bit about depression and how that looks for people and why that is something that actually is a thing. Thanks.